Hofstra student, class of 2014. Talking about how the Mets of the late 80s should be remembered, so take it away.
I'm here to talk about the Mets of the late 1980s and the legacy they have. And I know you're looking at me, I'm 19 years old. I obviously wasn't alive during it. Trust me, I did my research. I think I know what I'm talking about. There are a lot of phrases thrown around to describe sports teams of the past. But is there a higher honor for a professional sports franchise than to be labeled as a dynasty? Being a dynasty validates every single action from the team, whether it be a trade, a coaching decision, or the actual performance of the athletes on the field. Dynasties also come with the perks of being remembered for generations. These teams come and go so infrequently that the ones that do exist are rarely mentioned. Championship teams are legendary, but dynasties are immortal. Back in early November, I came across an intriguing article pertaining to this very word. The Patriots had just come off a heart-wrenching loss to the Giants at home, and it caused a strong reaction up in the Massachusetts area. A columnist for the Boston Herald named Ron Borges even commented that it was games like these that lead to the death of dynasties. At first, I initially dismissed the article as absurd, believing that his column simply served as a heat-of-the-moment reaction after a difficult loss by the hometown team. But while conducting my research for my topic today, which discusses what was and what wasn't for the Mets of the 1980s, my train of thought continuously kept flashing back to the beginning of Borges' article, in which he wrote, "Dynasties do not end in spectacular collapse or fiery conflagration. They end from the corrosive effect of winning, eaten bit by bit until the edge is no longer on your side of the line of scrimmage." This is a loaded statement, but Borges' reference to winning serving as a deterrent to future success was what caught my attention. After all, winning is the clear-cut #1 goal of participating in a team sport. How can it be possible that this sustained prowess will infringe on a team's ability to win down the road? The idea that achieving your ultimate goal is counterproductive to the team's future does sound strange, but it's also true. If you are looking for confirmation, look no further than the second half of the 1980s for the New York Mets. After building a team with a perfect mix of young prospects and proven veteran commodities, General Manager Frank Cashen thought he had concocted a team that would win not one championship, but several. Instead, during his tenure, which lasted from 1980 to 1991, the Mets only won 2 division titles, highlighted by the 1986 championship. Now, of all the things that went wrong following the season in which everything went right, where did the issues stem from? Many factors played a role, but perhaps nothing more than the overwhelming achievements by the '86 Mets doomed the team moving forward. Before examining their unceremonious fall from grace, it would be irresponsible not to acknowledge their incredible ascent into baseball's elite. Frank Cashen's brilliant construction of the squad will forever be Exhibit A in terms of rebuilding a decimated franchise. In addition to rejuvenating the farm system, Cashen made several deals that would help form the core of the Mets. On his way to 1986, Cashen swung a variety of trades that would land Sid Fernandez, Ray Knight, Ron Darling, and Howard Johnson. But of course, Cashen's most important deals were the ones that brought in Keith Hernandez and the late Gary Carter. In his time with the Mets, Hernandez would prove to be the same hitting and fielding force in Flushing as he was in St. Louis. His drive and focus rubbed off on all his teammates and cemented a locker room-wide desire to win at all costs. Gary Carter was acquired a couple of years later, and his arrival helped an incredibly gifted pitching staff reach its potential. He also would add an extra threat to an already potent lineup, slugging over 100 home runs in 4 seasons with the Mets. These trades, coupled with great drafting and development, put the Mets at the forefront of baseball for the first time in over a decade. And in 1986, they would bring a championship back to Flushing for the first time since 1969. Now, despite winning only 2 championships throughout the franchise's 50-year existence, the '86 Mets stand out not only as one of the most important teams in Mets history, but in New York's history. One of the reasons for this level of fame is that the '86 Mets serve as sports' ultimate paradox. They entered spring training with so much cockiness and arrogance that even Rex Ryan would feel overwhelmed. Yet, after 108 games, winning the NL East by a commanding 20.5 games, and being everything Davey Johnson said they would be in spring training, the Mets' postseason climb to a world championship is defined by the team's ability to come back and overcome the odds when all hope seemed lost. Even though throughout the regular season it seemed like a place in World Series would be inevitable for the Amazons, the Mets were in jeopardy of losing control of the NLCS in virtually every game. With the prospect of Mike Scott starting 3 games in the series looming, the Mets would be forced to win every single game in which Scott didn't take the hill. A daunting task, considering they had to face off against Nolan Ryan and Bob Nepper in the other 4th. Although it sounds preposterous that the swaggering Mets would be this shaken by one man, the sad truth was that Scott was in their heads. Ray Knight, who had the pulse of the locker room down as good as anyone on the roster, conceded that if the Mets faced Scott in Game 7 with the World Series on the line, they would have lost. They were more concerned with finding evidence that confirmed their theory that Scott was scuffing the ball, rather than figuring out a way to hit it. They struck out 14 times against him in Game 1 in a 1-0 defeat. They managed 1 run against him in a Game 4 loss. And if the Mets hadn't won Game 6, they would have faced him one more time a day later. Against a very formidable opponent, the Mets did what they had to. They won every single game that Mike Scott didn't start. And they did it in dramatic fashion, winning 3 of the 4 games in extra innings. The matchup was set. The Mets would face off against the Boston Red Sox in the Fall Classic, a team surging after coming back from a 3-1 deficit in the ALCS. And the Red Sox converted this momentum into 2 stunning victories to open the World Series at Shea Stadium. Just like the NLCS, the Mets had their backs up against the wall and were in a dogfight to survive. They were able to reel off 2 road wins to even it up, but lost Game 5 thanks to a disappointing effort from Dwight Gooden. And of course, there was Game 6, which seemed so out of reach that Kevin Mitchell was in the clubhouse calling his travel agent to book the quickest flight back to his offseason home. But the Mets pulled that one out too, and fittingly came back from 3 runs down in Game 7 to win it all. The 1986 Mets can be characterized by many words, depending on who you ask. The history books mark them down simply as champions. Their opponents would use a lot of choice words that I obviously cannot use right now. And if you took each game from October, converted it into a script, and sent it to a movie director, he would label them as an uplifting story about a feisty squad that never gave up. Even though the final result was a coronation of years of building and overwhelming domination in the regular season, the month of October presented roadblocks that very few teams would be able to overcome. All these factors have catapulted the '86 Mets into an exclusive hierarchy of truly iconic baseball teams. Unfortunately, their vast success also validated a lot of actions that would normally be detrimental to a team's success. While they would be competitive for a few more seasons, the crumbling of the dynasty that never was began the moment Jesse Orosco launched his glove in the New York sky as a world champion. In reality, the demise actually began the next day, when Dwight Gooden mysteriously failed to appear at the team's victory parade. Last year, in an interview with ESPN, he conceded that he was too high and too paranoid to leave the drug dealer's apartment and decided to just watch the parade on television. He said this behavior continued into the offseason as the thrill of nightlife became too addicting for him to overcome. He believes it was at this point that his life began to fall apart. Of course, others believe that Doc's career began spiraling out of control before the Mets won it all. In April of 1986, Commissioner Uberoth told Ray Knight that the league was investigating a young African-American superstar on the Mets, and were fairly certain he was doing hard drugs. Knight initially thought he was talking about Darryl Strawberry, but Strawberry told Knight it was actually Gooden that had been using cocaine for over a year. Knight confronted Strawberry, but Strawberry told Knight that, Knight immediately told Johnson, which was useless. While Johnson displayed his bravado in front of the media and even his own players, he would fail to impose any sense of discipline on the Wild clubhouse. Davey Johnson was not going to do anything that would jeopardize the team's success that season, even if it meant standing by idly as his ace's life slowly deteriorated. As long as the Mets were winning, nothing would change. Johnson took the same passive approach when handling his outfielder, whose problems were a lot clearer than Gooden's were. Darryl Strawberry had been using cocaine since 1983, and would repeatedly show up at the ballpark exhausted from a night on the town. Despite Johnson's pleadings, Strawberry would continue to beat up his body night after night, and his performance would suffer. He would occasionally request days off due to an intense hangover, and when he did play, it wasn't nearly at the level that fans had become accustomed to. Just a few years earlier, Gooden and Strawberry were heralded as pieces that would lead the Mets to prominence after a decade of futility. While this theory proved to be prophetic, the team's success wasn't as much due to these young superstars, but rather the team built around them. The team's dominating season placed Gooden and Strawberry's regression out of the spotlight, so no one went out of their way to address it. And when Gooden failed a drug test in spring training just 5 5 months after not showing up to the parade, a wave of shock overcame the clubhouse. But in reality, the signs of Goodman's drug use were obvious. The only problem was that the coaches, players, and fans were too distracted by that shiny object the best team in October gets. The front office's negligence to properly address the demise of their two prized possessions started a domino effect that cut into the heart of the Mets. 1 month after his absence from the parade, Goodman and a group of friends were arrested due to fighting a police officer. Curiously, one day after Doc's arrest, Kevin Mitchell was traded in a 7-player deal that would bring in Kevin Reynolds. It is said that Cashman thought that Kevin Mitchell was a negative influence on Starbrand Goodman and wanted him out of the clubhouse. Mitchell would go on to win the MVP in 1989, a season in which the Mets would lose the NL East by 6 games. And McReynolds quietly put up quiet numbers, but his nonchalant attitude turned off his fiery teammates, especially compared with the man that he was traded for. The trading of Mitchell was a prelude to a shift in philosophy from the Mets front office. Instead of relying on the development of prospects, they used them as trade chips for veterans. Cashman also dealt away some of the favorites from the 1986 club. Wally Backman was shipped out in 1988 to open up a spot for Craig Jeffries, which seemed like a prudent baseball move at the time. Backman was about to turn 30, and Jeffries was one of the most well-regarded prospects in all of baseball. But Backman was beloved in the clubhouse, and Jeffries struggled to fill his shoes. Like McReynolds, Jeffrey was aloof and generally distant from the rowdy clubhouse. Although his teammates likely never would have accepted him, his biggest problem was that he did not produce on the field. And after a disappointing tenure with the team, he and Kevin McReynolds were traded in the same deal after the 1991 season. By 91, only Darling, Fernandez, Gooden, Tuffle, and Howard Johnson remained from the championship-winning club. That year, the Mets finished in 5th place with a 77-84 record, and watched helplessly as Frank Cashman, the architect of what was supposed to be a powerhouse, quietly stepped down amid a losing franchise. Even through all the internal destruction, whether it be from off-the-field struggles or poorly managed personnel decisions, it is important to remember that the Mets did not fade quietly into the sunset. It looked like 1988 was turning into a carbon copy of '86. After winning 100 ball games, the Mets faced off against the Los Angeles Dodgers in the NLCS, a team they had beaten 10 out of 11 times during the regular season. But like so many problems to come in the future, the Mets were sent back before the postseason started by a critical event off the diamond. Late in September, Bobby Ojeda severed part of his middle finger a couple weeks before the playoffs would begin, rendering him unavailable. In a series that would go 7 games, his presence was undoubtedly missed. And in 7 excruciating games, the Dodgers shocked the world and knocked out the Mets. It would be the Mets' last appearance in the playoffs as a division champion until 2006. While the team's self-destruction was mostly due to the flaming out of the team score, a plethora of front office decisions that would backfire, and a thinned-out farm system that would not be able to overcome these mistakes, it is impossible not to wonder how different things would have been had the wild card been implemented a decade earlier. If the wild card was in place, it is very possible we would remember these Mets much more fondly. Instead of 1984 and 1985 being remembered as building seasons, the Mets would have had a shot to make their mark in the postseason as a young and up-and-coming ball club. Additionally, they would have made the tournament in 1987 if the wild card was in existence. That would have meant the Mets would have made the playoffs in 5 straight seasons, firmly establishing themselves as the team of the 80s, and possibly obtaining more jewelry on the way. These what-ifs continue to haunt fans that witnessed the ascension, peak, and decline of this fascinating ball club. But so many questions continue to linger. What was the point that sent the club spiraling back to irrelevancy with no turning back? How come they have been unable to put together a long-term contender since? Nearly a quarter of a century later, these questions still persist today, with no true answer. So with all of this said, how should the New York Mets of the 1980s be remembered? They were an unforgettable championship team, a team of 25-plus guys that for one magical season, the entire city of New York felt connected to. Unfortunately, the same qualities that have enhanced the 1986 club status are the very same aspects that prevented the same team from cementing their place in baseball history. As I said earlier, championship teams are legendary, the dynasties are immortal. The 1980s Mets simply had to settle for legendary. Thank you.